final centuries of the 4th millennium BCE, the Nile Valley was not a nation, but a geological pressure cooker. To understand the unification of Egypt as the first state-building war, one must first view the landscape as a commander views a topographical map, not as scenery, but as a series of constraints and opportunities. We begin not with a battle, but with the logistical friction of the river itself. The Nile was the primary engine of life, yet in 3100 BCE, it was a fractured asset. The two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, existed in a state of symbiotic tension. Upper Egypt, the south, was a narrow ribbon of fertile silt hemmed in by the unforgiving high deserts. Lower Egypt, the north, was the expansive, watery labyrinth of the delta. For the rulers of the south, the delta was a tactical bottleneck. It controlled the access to the Mediterranean and the lucrative trade routes to the Levant. For the north, the south was a looming, martial shadow that controlled the source of the water upon which their survival depended. King Narmer, or the figure history conflates with the legendary Menes, inherited a geopolitical stalemate that had persisted for centuries. This was the grand design problem. How does a regional chieftain transform a collection of warring nomes into a singular, monolithic entity? The answer was not found in diplomacy, but in the surgical perspective of total territorial absorption. Narmer's objective was the first of its kind in human record. He was not looking for a raid or a seasonal tribute. He was looking to end the friction of fragmentation. To do this, he had to solve the paradox of the inundation. Every year, the Nile flooded, depositing the silt that fueled the economy. However, this flood also created a period of enforced idleness for the peasantry. In a stroke of administrative genius that predates the Roman legions, the southern leadership realized that this idle labor force was their greatest force multiplier. If they could feed these men during the flood, they could weaponize them. The War for Unification was, therefore, a triumph of the granary as much as the mace. The impossible stakes of this conflict cannot be overstated. Failure for Narmer did not mean a retreat to his ancestral lands in this or Abydos. It meant the collapse of the southern protostate under the weight of its own mobilization. By committing his forces to a northern campaign, Narmer was burning the boats. He was wagering the entire caloric surplus of his kingdom on the belief that a unified Egypt would be exponentially more powerful than the sum of its fractured parts. This was the birth of grand strategy. Narmer viewed the battlefield as a canvas where the brushstrokes were infantry columns and the pigment was the blood of the delta elites. He recognized that the delta's strength, its sprawling, marshy geography, was also its primary tactical weakness. The north lacked a center of gravity. It was a decentralized collection of mercantile hubs. Narmer's doctrine was to provide that center through the absolute, terrifying presence of a singular god-king. As we analyze the geopolitical canvas, we must also look at the technological craft of the era's statcraft. The unification was the first time propaganda was used as a kinetic weapon. The Narmer Palette is not just art. It is a mission statement. It is a piece of psychological warfare designed to broadcast the inevitability of southern dominance. It tells the story of a king who is not merely a man, but a force of nature, a bull trampling the walls of a city, a predator stalking the weak. The surgical reality of this period was that the delta was becoming too wealthy for its own safety. As trade with the Near East brought copper, wine, and oil into the north, the south watched with predatory interest. The catalyst of statehood was greed tempered by necessity. The south had the military tradition. The north had the resources. The collision was inevitable. In the minds of the southern strategists, the delta was a salient that needed to be flattened. The geography of the Nile allowed for a unique interior lines of communication advantage. Narmer could move troops downriver with the current and communicate via fast runners along the desert margins. He could achieve a tempo of operations that the disparate tribes of the north could not possibly counter. They would be defeated in detail, one town at a time, before they could ever form a unified front. This was the aperture through which Narmer viewed his world. He saw a river that was a jagged, broken line and decided to make it straight. He saw a people who were divided by geography and decided to bind them through the art of survival. The mobilization was a masterpiece of logistical friction, a grinding, relentless push toward the sea. When the first Southern war galley pushed off into the current, it wasn't just carrying soldiers. It was carrying the blueprint for the next 3,000 years of human history. The design of conflict was complete. The order of battle was set. The canvas was primed, and the first stroke of the mace was about to descend, turning the river red and the crown white. To the modern observer, the unification of Egypt is often viewed through the lens of mytha, sudden, divinely ordained conquest. But for the master military historian, the reality is far more compelling. The triumph of King Narmer was not a miracle of the gods. It was a miracle of the granary. Before the first mace was swung, the war had already been won in the administrative Atelier of the south. This was the birth of the pre-war machine, a system of mobilization so sophisticated it allowed a Neolithic society to project power across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain. The primary tactical constraint of the 4th millennium BCE was not the enemy's wall, but the caloric ceiling. In an era before coinage, standing armies, or professional logistics corps, the ability to keep a soldier fed in the field was the ultimate force multiplier. Narmer's genius lay in his realization that the Nile's natural cycles could be harnessed as a logistical engine. This was the logistics of the Inundation. In the pre-dynastic period, war was traditionally a localized affair, short, sharp raids conducted between harvest and planting. Narmer revolutionized this by aligning the tempo of operations with the Akhet, the season of the flood. When the Nile overflowed its banks between June and September, the entire agricultural workforce of Upper Egypt was rendered idle. In any other society, this would be a period of dormant productivity. Under Narmer, it became the mobilization phase. By utilizing a centralized storage system, proto-bureaucracies centered around the shrines of Horus the Southern State collected taxation in kind. Vast quantities of emmer, wheat, and barley were stockpiled. This surplus served as the fuel for the machine. Narmer did not merely recruit soldiers. He contracted them, offering bread and beer in exchange for service during the flood months. This transformed the peasantry into a seasonal yet highly disciplined engineering and combat force. The Nile was the high-speed rail of the ancient world, while the northern delta tribes were forced to move. Through thick marshes and shifting silt on foot, Narmer's forces utilized the interior lines of the river. The construction of the war flotilla was the single most important technological investment of the campaign. These were not yet the grand galleys of the New Kingdom, but sophisticated papyrus bundle and cedar-planked vessels. Their design was a masterpiece of functional elegance. They had to be shallow-drafted enough to navigate the receding floodwaters of the delta, yet sturdy enough to carry crates of stone mace heads, bundles of arrows, and hundreds of jars of preserved rations. The logistics of the flotilla allowed for a surgical application of force. Narmer could bypass strongholds, landing his shock troops directly at the most vulnerable points of the northern infrastructure. This created a logistical friction for the defenders. They could never be sure where the southern hammer would fall. The river acted as a conveyor belt, constantly bringing fresh levies and supplies from the deep south to the front lines in the north. In the Atelier of Hierakonpolis and Abydos, archaeologists have found evidence of what can only be described as industrial-scale weapon production. The standardization of the pear-shaped mace head is a testament to this. By moving away from the disc-shaped maces of earlier periods, which were prone to chipping upon impact, Narmer's craftsmen developed a weapon designed for maximum kinetic transfer. This was the technological craft of the era. Each mace head was bored with mathematical precision to fit a standardized handle, ensuring that any soldier could pick up any weapon and know its balance and weight. The same standardization applied to the flint knapping industry. Thousands of bifacial, ripple flake, knives, and arrowheads were produced in state-sanctioned workshops. This was not the work of individual hunters, but of a military-industrial complex in its infancy. Perhaps the most analytical aspect of Narmer's machine was its hierarchy. To manage thousands of men across a theater spanning 500 miles, a surgical command structure was required. We see the emergence of titles: the seal bearers, the commanders of the bowmen, and the royal scribes. These were the men who managed the friction of war. They calculated the days-to-ration ratios. They mapped the shifting sandbars of the delta. They ensured that the order of battle was not just a list of names, but a functioning organism. This C2 architecture allowed Narmer to operate with a unit cohesion that was previously unknown. While the Delta chiefs fought as a loose confederation of big men, Narmer fought as a state. The physics of the mace were optimized for the one-hit kill. Unlike a blade, which could be turned by bone or snagged in cloth, the mace delivered its entire kinetic energy into a single, devastating point of impact. A strike to the cranium or the clavicle was instantly incapacitating. Narmer's elites were trained in the art of the smite, a specific, overhead delivery designed to crush the skull of an opponent, even if they were attempting to parry with a reed shield. This was the Mace-Head Doctrine, the realization that in the chaos of a melee, simplicity and blunt force are the ultimate arbiters of victory. While the mace bearers provided the hamar, the anvil was provided by the southern archers. These units utilized the self-bow, constructed from single pieces of acacia or cedar wood. Their role was to provide enfilade fire from the desert ridges or the decks of the river galleys. In the war atelier perspective, the archers were the first force multipliers. Their objective was not necessarily to kill every enemy, but to disrupt the unit cohesion of the northern levies. By raining down flint-tipped arrows, each one a masterpiece of lithic craft, they forced the Delta defenders to huddle behind their shields. pinning them in place while Narmer's heavy infantry closed the distance. This was a primitive yet effective form of suppression and maneuver. The most innovative component of the order of battle was the riverine shock troop. These were specialized units stationed on the MSHW transport galleys. In the marshy environment of the Delta, land-based movement was a logistical friction. Narmer's solution was to use the river as a flanking route. His flotilla allowed him to achieve local superiority at any point along the Nile. The ships were equipped with high castles, raised platforms, that allowed archers to fire down into the northern settlements. Once the defenders were suppressed, the shock troops would leap from the vessels directly into the heart of the enemy's center of gravity. This was the first recorded use of amphibious assault to decapitate a defensive line. To contrast the southern machine, we must analyze the northern order of battle. The lower Egyptian forces were not a unified army, but a collection of nodal defenses. Each city-state budo says Mendes had its own local militia. Their weaponry was diverse but lacked standardization. Many utilized disc maces, which, while elegant, lacked the durability of the southern pear-shaped mace. Their tactical doctrine was primarily defensive, relying on the natural salience created by the delta's myriad waterways. They fought with the desperation of men defending their homes, but they lacked a unified command and control, C2. They were a reactive force, always one step behind the proactive tempo of Narmer's southern machine. Behind the map view of these maneuvers lay the trench view of the individual soldier. The art of survival in 3100 BCE was a brutal, intimate affair. There was no standoff distance. Victory meant standing close enough to smell the breath of your enemy and feeling the friction of his bone shattering under your mace. The heat was an ever-present enemy. Dehydration was a constant operational risk. The surgical efficiency of the Southern Army relied on their ability to maintain physical integrity under the grueling Egyptian sun. This required a constant supply of water and rations, a logistical masterpiece that allowed the order of battle to remain combat effective throughout the long push north. As the two forces converged, the tactical blueprint was clear. Narmer brought a standardized, centralized, and hydraulically mobile army against a fragmented, defensive, and stationary opponent. The order of battle was not just a list of soldiers. It was a clash of two different philosophies of power. The South had turned the art of war into a science of the state. They had mastered the combined arms of the bow, the mace, and the boat. The North was still fighting the wars of the past, while Narmer was writing the manual for the future. The canvas was now stained with the initial skirmishes. The order of battle was proven. Now, the friction of war would decide the fate of the two lands, as Narmer's flotilla crossed the invisible threshold. Between the sandstone cliffs of the south and the silty expanse of the north, the design of conflict met its greatest adversary, the geography of the delta. In this phase, we move from the atelier of preparation to the surgical reality of a theater-wide offensive. This was the first time in history a military commander had to manage the friction of a landscape that was actively conspiring against his order of battle. The Nile Delta was not a single battlefield. It was 1,000 mini-theaters of war. It was a salient of reeds, papyrus marshes, and shifting distributaries that nullified the mass effect of traditional infantry formations. For the southern followers of Horus, the Delta was a tactical nightmare. The interior lines of communication that had served them so well in the narrow valley of the south were now fractured into a dozen different river branches. Narmer's grand strategy was forced to adapt. He could not simply march a monolithic column north. To do so would be to invite enfilade fire from the hidden marshes and to risk being bogged down in the seasonal mud. Instead, he utilized a three-pronged advance, a masterpiece of distributed lethality. The first major point of friction occurred at the apex of the delta, near the site that would later become Memphis. This was the gateway to the north. The northern defenders had fortified the high ground, creating a fortress salient that commanded the river. Here, Narmer encountered the grit and sweat of siege warfare. The South lacked heavy siege engines. Instead, they relied on infiltration tactics. Under the cover of the suppressive fire from his archers on the galley decks, Narmer's shock troops conducted a nighttime amphibious assault. They used the high floodwaters to float their vessels right up to the base of the mud brick enclosures. This was the surgical application of terrain using the very flood that was meant to protect the city as a ladder for the invader. The struggle for the gateway was a turning point. When the white wall fell, the psychological center of gravity of the north was shattered. The fall of Memphis was not just a territorial gain. It was a force multiplier for southern morale and a death knell for northern unity. As the army pushed deeper into the delta, the friction of war intensified. The campaign became a series of clearance operations. The northern levies, realizing they could not win in a pitched combined arms battle, retreated into the deep marshes. Narmer's response was a doctrine of attrition. He utilized his logistical superiority to starve out the marsh strongholds. By controlling the main river channels, he prevented the transport of grain between northern towns. One by one, the nodal defenses of the delta were forced to either fight in the open where the southern mace-bearers would annihilate them or surrender to the slow friction of hunger. We must pause the map view to look at the individual struggle. In the Battle of the Reeds, the art of survival was tested to its limit. Imagine a southern infantryman, his cowhide shield heavy with moisture, moving through water that reached his chest. The tactical blueprint of the phalanx was useless here. Combat devolved into a series of micro-engagements, a Mace-Head strike beneath the water's surface, a sudden flint knife thrust from behind a papyrus stalk. This was symmetrical violence at its most chaotic. The surgical intent of the king was carried out in the mud, one bloody meter at a time. By the midpoint of the campaign, the canvas of strategy was beginning to show the final image. Narmer had successfully navigated the logistical friction of the delta. He had transformed a potential quagmire into a surgical demonstration of power. The North was no longer a cohesive entity. It was a collection of shattered salients, isolated by the southern desert columns and decapitated by the central flotilla. The friction had been immense, and the human forge had been tempered in the heat of 1,000 small skirmishes. But the grand design was holding. Narmer had reached the pivot point of history. The disparate towns of the Delta were now merely tactical problems to be solved before the final grand unification could be proclaimed. The campaign for the Delta was the first proof that state building requires more than just a victory in the field. It requires the surgical persistence to hunt down and absorb every pocket of resistance until the canvas is clean. In the war atelier of antiquity, every campaign eventually narrows from a broad strategic sweep to a singular kinetic pivot point. For King Narmer, this was the field of the bound, the moment when the tactical friction of the Delta campaign coalesced into a final, decisive engagement. This was not merely a battle for territory. It was a surgical operation to decapitate the very idea of northern sovereignty. As the southern machine ground its way toward the Mediterranean coast, the remaining northern forces levies from the great centers of Bruto and Sais were pushed into a strategic cul-de-sac. They chose their final stand in the marshy plains of the northwestern Delta. This was a salient of desperation. The terrain was a complex mosaic of hydraulic obstacles. To the north lay the sea. To the south, the advancing southern flotilla. The northern king, whose name is lost to the friction of history, but whose presence is immortalized as the captive on the Narmer Palette, attempted to utilize the wetland salients to negate Narmer's combined arms advantage. They hoped the soft mud would act as a force nullifier, stripping the southern heavy infantry of their momentum. Narmer, viewing the battlefield as a canvas of geometry, did not commit to a simple frontal assault. Instead, he executed a surgical envelopment that remains a masterpiece of early military craft. Utilizing his riverine dominance, Narmer split his forces. While a decoy force of light archers engaged the northern center in a suppressing action, his elite shock troops bypassed the main defensive line via the hidden distributaries of the Nile. They landed behind the northern position, achieving a state of perfect enfilade. The northern levies, suddenly finding themselves under two-front friction, suffered a total collapse of unit cohesion. The field of the bound became a slaughterhouse of symmetrical violence. The climax of the battle was the hunt for the northern leadership. In the war Atelier philosophy, a victory is incomplete without the decapitation of the command structure, Narmer's personal guard. The followers of Horus pushed through the center of the northern line with relentless tempo. The Narmer Palette captures this moment with anatomical precision. We see the king, the supreme architect of violence, standing over a kneeling northern chieftain. This was the turning point where the war shifted from a kinetic struggle to a ritualized consolidation of power. By capturing the northern king alive, Narmer did not just win a battle. He acquired a kingdom. The prisoner was bound not just in leather cords, but in the logistical reality of the new state. On the ground, in the trench view, the field of the bound was a nightmare of lithic and bone, the standardized southern. Maces proved their technological superiority one last time. In the close quarters of the marsh, the northern disc maces were too unwieldy, often shattering against the southern cowhide shields. The art of survival for the northern soldier evaporated as the southern archers, firing from the high decks of the galleys, rained down suppressive fire into the huddled masses of the delta levies. The friction was absolute. There was no room for maneuver, only the surgical application of the mace and the flint knife. The mud of the delta, once the lifeblood of the north, was now the gravel of the grave for 10,000 men. The field of the bound was the final force multiplier for the southern cause. The casualties were asymmetric. The northern leadership was annihilated and their order of battle was erased. From a surgical perspective, Narmer had achieved the ultimate goal of grand strategy. He had forced his enemy into a position where their only options were total destruction or total assimilation. The friction of war had finally burned away the resistance of the delta. The field of the bound was the aperture through which the first dynasty was born. As the sun set over the bloody marshes of the northwest, the two lands were no longer two. They were a single canvas, ready to be painted with the white and red of the unified crown. The turning point was behind them. The assessment of empire was about to begin. The smoke of the delta's burning strongholds eventually cleared, leaving behind a silence that was not merely the absence of conflict, but the birth of a new social order. In this final Atelier assessment, we must strip away the mythological veneer of the Pharaoh and analyze the unification as a surgical restructuring of human civilization. Narmer's victory was the first successful total war, a conflict that did not end with a treaty, but with the absolute absorption of the loser into the winner's administrative blueprint. We begin with a cold analysis of the casualties. History often focuses on the fallen soldiers, but the primary casualty of 3100 BCE was regional autonomy. Narmer's campaign was designed to be a systemic reset. The Narmer Palette provides the fact check for this period of violent integration. On the reverse side, we see two rows of decapitated prisoners, their heads placed between their legs. This was more than a display of cruelty. It was a surgical statement of the new reality. The delta's center of gravity, its local chieftains and mercantile elites, had been physically removed. By eliminating the command and control of the north, Narmer ensured that the friction of rebellion would find no fuel. Estimates of the human toll are difficult to quantify, but the archaeological record shows a sharp decline in the distinct material culture of Lower Egypt following the unification. The art of war had achieved its ultimate end, the cultural decapitation of the enemy. The true masterpiece of Narmer's victory was not the battle itself, but the assessment of what to do with the peace. He did not retreat to the south with his spoils. Instead, he founded a new capital at the balance of the two lands, Memphis. This was a surgical geographic decision. Memphis served as a pivot point, a strategic node from which the king could monitor both the Delta-S trade and the Valley-S production. The logistical machine that had fueled the war was now repurposed for the logistics of the state. The taxation in kind system was standardized across the entire Nile, creating the first command economy in history. The grit and sweat of the soldier were now the grit and sweat of the royal laborer, building the dikes and granaries that would secure the dynasty for centuries. The pshunt, or the double crown. was the visual manifestation of the art of war becoming the art of governance. It combined the white crown of the south with the red crown of the north. In the war atelier perspective, this was the ultimate force multiplier. By adopting the symbols of the conquered, Narmer practiced a surgical diplomacy. He did not merely rule as an occupier. He redefined himself as the protector of the whole. This was the birth of national identity as a tool of strategic stability. It reduced the friction of governance by providing the conquered population with a theological reason to obey. Narmer's campaign fundamentally altered the DNA of conflict. Before the unification, war was an art of the raid. After Narmer, it became the art of the state. The war proved that the granary is as lethal as the mace. Future pharaohs would never again rely on simple tribal levies. They would maintain permanent bureaucracies to fuel their campaigns. The Nile became the standardized corridor for power projection. The Egyptian military would remain a river-based force for the next 2 millennia, using the water as a high-speed salient into Africa and the Levant. Narmer established the doctrine of the smite. Every subsequent pharaoh would depict themselves in the same surgical pose, raising a mace over a cowering enemy. This was the grand design of psychological warfare, reminding the populace that the king was the sole arbiter of violence. As we close our aperture on the first state-building war, we see a canvas that has been completely repainted. The friction of fragmentation was over. The impossible stakes had been won. King Narmer, or the collective memory of the men who fought under his banner, had solved the tactical dilemma of the Neolithic age. He had proven that statehood is a military achievement. The human forge of the Nile had produced something entirely new, a civilization that functioned like a single, massive war machine in the service of a singular will. The assessment is clear. The unification of Egypt was the surgical act that separated prehistory from history. It was a masterpiece of logistical friction and kinetic intent that set the template for every empire that would follow. The Mace-Head may have been made of stone, but the state it forged was as enduring as the river itself. History is a canvas, and the brushstrokes are written in logistics and friction. Here at War Atelier, we don't just tell stories, we dissect the machinery of conflict. If you want to see the battlefields of the past through a master's lens, ensure you've enabled notifications. Our next deep dive takes us from the silt of the Nile to the bronze of the Levant. Don't just watch history, analyze it. Join the Atelier today.